anthropology and Spanish student here at UNC, and this was a paper that I wrote for my senior seminar in anthropology last semester. And the paper is titled Systemic Depreciation, an Analysis of Non-White Neighborhood Vulnerability to Urban Gentrification in Denver, Colorado. And so my research question was very simple to begin with. What is gentrification? How do we define it? And so the working definition I'm using is from Mark Hughes. Gentrification is defined by him as the displacement of a lower income population by a higher income population through some combination of economic, physical, and social upgrading. I also wanted to know who's perpetuating and promoting gentrification, as well as who are the affected populations. Is gentrification always a negative thing? Is it always a positive thing? Is it a mix of the two? And my main purpose was to investigate urban gentrification occurring in 2016 in Denver to keep it local and to keep it as relevant as possible. So my thesis statement is that non-white neighborhoods in Denver, Colorado are more likely to suffer from capital depreciation and therefore are more vulnerable to urban gentrification and displacement. Systemic depreciation is this combination of systemic racism and then the kind of depreciation that these specific neighborhoods are experiencing. So it refers to the oppression and marginalization of non-white populations within the United States, and these factors can affect not only gentrification but other issues as well. I used 3 different theoretical perspectives to frame my research. I utilized Neil Smith's rent gap theory, Joe Fagan's theory of systemic racism, as well as Michael E. Smith's generative planning theory. So with regard to the rent gap theory, we start with capital depreciation. These are decisions that result in the depreciation of a neighborhood physically, as well as the depreciation economically speaking. We also have to look at the cycles of use of this neighborhood, given the kind of wear and tear and then lack of maintenance that lead to lowered property values in these areas. So this leads to what Neil Smith refers to as the rent gap. We see that property values get low and then the potential ground rent is very high, so this is the perfect time for investors to come in because it's the most profitable. So when we look at actual ground rent level, we're looking at the amount, the quantifiable amount with which that area is worth under present use, whereas the potential ground rent level refers to the maximum potential given the best use of that land in the existing buildings therein. I then utilized Joe Fagan's theory of systemic racism because I think it informs rent gap very well. So Joe Fagan asserts that racial prejudice is a material, social, and ideological reality that is well embedded in all U.S. major institutions. So we're talking about the government, the economy, education, etc. And he asserts that systemic racism is not just a surface-level feature of the United States society, but it rather pervades and interconnects major social groups and institutions across society. For the purpose of my research, I wanted to broaden his definition because Joe Fagan really focuses on white on black oppression, but I think we need to broaden that to white on non-white oppression and look at immigrant groups as well as native groups and other populations that are being oppressed in a similar way. And so Joe Fagan talks about this socio-racial continuum that immigrants fall upon, that non-white people fall upon with regard to social acceptability. So what is socially acceptable is white, and what is not acceptable is black. And immigrant groups and other non-white groups fall somewhere on this continuum. And they don't just fall on this continuum, they're actually put there by dominant whites. The final theoretical perspective I'm using is the generative planning theory, and this has to do more with solutions than anything else. So Michael E. Smith talks about the idea of this bottom-up process of urban growth and organization and how much more beneficial it is when households and residents and neighborhoods are actually involved in the planning of their neighborhoods. The evidence I focused on was racially motivated zoning policies, redlining, and income inequality. Racially motivated zoning policies include expulsive zoning policies, so black neighborhoods being used for landfills and drug rehabilitation units and prisons and other blemishes upon residential areas. We also look at business legislation, business licensing legislation. So lower income work is generally prohibited from residential areas. So work like beauticians, barbers, mechanics working from their garage, these are things that are generally prohibited, whereas higher income work like accounting or insurance practices are not. We also see redlining, which is essentially it's mortgage lending discrimination based upon neighborhoods. We're looking at neighborhoods that have already been depreciated, and then mortgage lenders don't want to invest in this kind of high-risk situation. So any kind of weight given to neighborhood location with regard to mortgage lending can be referred to as redlining. Finally, I had to look at income inequality, specifically with regard to race and ethnicity. So regardless of geographical location throughout the United States, the average personal as well as household income of Blacks and Latinos is lower than the United States average, as well as lower than the average of white populations. So here are just some graphs to kind of show you those numbers. In the West, which is what Colorado is considered, the average personal income of someone white is about $40,000, whereas for Blacks it's $29,000, for Hispanics it's $25,000 a year. And then we look at the average household income, it's the same kind of idea. The average in the West is $81,000. For whites, it's about $85,000. For Blacks, $63,000. And for Hispanics, about $68,000 annually. So here are just a few quotes about that. African Americans are twice as likely to be turned down for loans when compared to white applicants of similar circumstances. Latinos are 1.5 times more likely to be turned down compared to white applicants. Upper income African Americans are more likely to be denied a loan or mortgage than middle income whites. And the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act states that for conventional home purchase loans in the year 2000, Blacks were twice as likely as whites to be rejected, and Hispanics were 40% more likely than whites to be turned down. And so I looked at 4 different cases of gentrification in Denver specifically, 2 historical cases, and then 2 cases that are happening right now. So if we look at the triangle right here, this is the Auraria neighborhood. It once was the Auraria neighborhood. It is now actually Auraria campus. It houses 3 different colleges. We have above that Highland. We have Highland West as well, but I'm specifically focused on Highland. And then the ones that I'm focusing on in terms of gentrification occurring today are Globeville and Elydia Swansea. These are up top. Same idea, same kind of map in terms of Denver neighborhoods, but now we're looking at percentages of Hispanic populations within these areas. And this is a map from 2014. So in 2014, you can see that in Auraria, there's far less of a Hispanic population than there once was, and as well as in the Highland. Globeville and Elydia Swansea are still predominantly Hispanic, but we're seeing a decline in those neighborhoods in terms of those populations given the kind of gentrification occurring right now. A little history about Auraria. It was Denver's oldest neighborhood. It was founded in 1858 by miners because they had found gold in the area. And the population there shifted from being predominantly European descent and European immigrants to being a Hispanic neighborhood in the 1920s. In 1941, there was a report conducted that listed at least 84% of Auraria's housing as being substandard. So that's an example of that kind of capital depreciation that we're looking at. And Colorado legislature had been looking for a long time for an adequate space for this large higher learning facility. In 1969 survey, 89% of Aurarian households were Hispanic. And it should be noted that the Auraria neighborhood was influential during the Chicano movement in the 60s. So a lot of the most prolific Chicano leaders during that time saw the building and the implementation of this campus as a direct affront to the kind of social progress that they were making. We then look at the Highland. Highland was a refuge for Irish immigrants during the 1800s. Again, kind of like with Auraria, it shifted populations to a predominantly Italian population. And then in the 1940s, it became a predominantly Latinx Hispanic neighborhood. Zoning laws like the ones I was talking about earlier, noise ordinances, business licensing legislation, have all negatively impacted this area. And as I said before, we're seeing a large decline of Hispanic population within Highland as more affluent white populations come in. Finally, I'm going to get to the urban gentrification that's occurring today in Denver. Specifically, we're talking about Globeville and Elydia Swansea, so here's a map of that. And here are just some pictures of that area. It's a highly industrialized area. The history of it is that it was actually built as a company town during the 1800s for smelters. And I'm sure we've all seen the Purina dog factory. There are slaughterhouses there, so it's a highly industrialized area. The 2 neighborhoods were actually split in half 2 times, once in the 1950s by the construction of I-25, and once again in the 60s by the construction of I-70. And the physical deterioration of this area is very obvious if you've ever been there. You can see that the sidewalks are uneven, that the pavement is not being maintained, and they have terrible drainage, and actually it causes flooding anytime it rains. Right now, Michael Hancock is the mayor of Denver, and he implemented the corridor of opportunity. He proposed this idea in 2013. It refers to 6 major redevelopment projects, and the first wave of that implementation actually started last fall. The expansion of I-70 is one of those big projects that Michael Hancock is proposing, and it will result in the loss of 56 homes and 18 businesses within these 2 neighborhoods. With regard to the residents of the Lydia Swansea, they are both predominantly Hispanic neighborhoods, with the Lydia Swansea being 84% Hispanic and Globeville being 68%. Both of these neighborhoods are well below the Denver average in terms of annual household income. The average annual household income in Denver is $73,000, and for Lydia Swansea it's about $44,000, $45,000, and in Globeville it's about $39,000. So the question is opportunity for whom when we talk about this corridor of opportunity. Right now there are people obviously losing their homes and unable to pay their rent because of this major reconstruction project. Furthermore, the information that these residents are being given is predominantly in English. There are no resources for Spanish-speaking populations. And so the people being most affected by these projects are not having access to any of the information regarding these projects. So my conclusion is that non-white neighborhoods in Denver, Colorado are far more likely to suffer from capital depreciation, as evidenced by the historic precedent for discriminatory zoning policies and neglect from city planning departments. Non-white neighborhoods in Denver, Colorado, therefore, are more vulnerable to urban gentrification than their white counterparts, as well as displacement. And that's evidenced by redlining, discriminatory financial lending practices, as well as income inequality. It is unclear as to whether or not this kind of gentrification is directly motivated by race, but what we can't do is ignore that or say that race is simply a side note, because it has its implications in every single piece of evidence that I've found. So some potential solutions are to utilize more generative planning theory and make sure that citizens are actively involved with the planning of these neighborhoods. We as citizens need to take charge and be involved and be informed and understand that this is what's happening and not to allow it to happen. Furthermore, we need to make race more of a part of the academic discussion regarding urban gentrification. Right now, race is, again, it's a footnote. It's not part of most academic definitions of gentrification, even though ubiquitously and colloquially we all talk about gentrification with this idea of race in mind. So if we bring it into the academic sphere, I think that will be something positive. And in terms of some future research, I think beyond racial income inequality is also unequal access to education and job opportunities. So these are things that I would look further into if I were to expand this paper a little bit more. And with that, if we have any time left, we can do some questions and discussion. So, anyone's question? Yes?
Thank you so much. Very nicely done. I appreciate it. Do you feel that you already kind of at the outset knew what the conclusions were going to be?
To a certain extent, yeah, I did. I mean, I was hoping not. When I originally started this research, I wanted to investigate artists in gentrification, actually. But the more research I did, the more I realized that we really need to bring race into the academic discussion, so I had to form-fit my paper that way. Yes?
Abigail. So I just wanted to hear a little bit more about future directions, and so where you would lead this project.
Sure.
If you had that opportunity, where would you take it to the next level?
I think for me, what was so exciting about this project was finding empirical evidence to support the theory of systemic racism. Often I think when we talk about racism in our country, we talk about it as though it's opinion or just emotion, and it's not founded in any evidence, and that's just not true. So to me, if I were to expand this project and look forward into the future, I would like to find more of that kind of real, substantial, empirical evidence that people cannot refute because it's the truth and it's right there. Specifically, I'd like to look into education because I think that's really where it all starts, is with our children and our treatment of our children, and kind of go from there. So after education, then we talk about job opportunities and things of that nature.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a lot of times when we discuss gentrification, it's always about class, right? Mm-hmm. So how would you pivot the discussion without leaving, of course, those behind who who are being left behind by class in gentrification as well. You know,
Yeah.
to elevate one without diminishing the other.
No, that's a really great question, because gentrification is something that doesn't necessarily discriminate with regards to poverty. It's something that I think affects, the majority of the people that it affects are people in poverty. And so we can't say that there aren't white people in poverty. That does exist, right? So I think we have to acknowledge the oppression that exists within oppression in order to tackle it efficiently. So class is certainly, you know, the forefront issue, but we have to look at the different factors that create class and the implications of those factors, if that makes sense. So to me, knowing that a neighborhood has been depreciated over, you know, decades, and that happens to be a black neighborhood or Hispanic neighborhood, there's far more substantial evidence towards people of color being affected, but it's not to say that other people are not affected as well.
Okay.
I think I'm out of time.
That's
Thank
it.
you so much. Appreciate it.